night was still, a dark velvet shroud draped over the city of Paris. The only light came from the flames of the pyre in the square before Notre Dame Cathedral, where the figure of a man, bound to the stake, stood defiantly amidst the licking tongues of fire. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning wood and flesh. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, gazed out over the assembled crowd, his eyes hard and unyielding. He could see the faces of his executioners, King Philip IV's men, the clergy who had condemned him, and the throngs of common people drawn by morbid curiosity. His voice, hoarse from the smoke, rose above the crackling of the flames. Pope Clement, King Philip, within the year, I summon you both before God's tribunal. You will answer for this injustice, and your line will be cursed until France is cleansed by fire and blood. His words cut through the night, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the flames surged, consuming him, but Jacques de Molay did not cry out. His curse had been spoken, a curse that would echo through the generations. As the fire devoured the last of the Templar Grand Masters, a figure in the shadows watched, unseen. Cloaked in darkness, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the memory of those fateful words. The cold dawn had just begun to break when King Philip IV's orders were delivered across France. In the silence before the city awoke, knights loyal to the crown stormed the Templar commanderies, breaking down doors and dragging the inhabitants from their beds. The streets echoed with the clatter of iron and the shouts of frightened men. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, stood by a window in his palace, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. His face was a mask of cold determination. The accusations against the Templars, heresy, blasphemy, the worship of the demon Baphomet, had been meticulously crafted. They were designed not only to destroy the Templars, but to strip them of their wealth and power, which Philip desperately needed to sustain his rule. In the torchlit chambers beneath the city, the Templars were subjected to horrors beyond imagining. The inquisitors, relentless in their pursuit of confessions, employed every method at their disposal: rack, thumbscrew, branding iron. The dungeons reeked of sweat and blood, and the cries of the tortured reverberated through the stone walls. "I confess," a Templar whispered, his voice broken, barely audible. "I confess to whatever you wish." These confessions, extracted under unimaginable duress, were recorded with cold precision. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the appearance of guilt, the justification for the annihilation of the Templars. As dawn broke, Philip IV watched the first light of day spread across the city. His plan was unfolding perfectly, but in the quiet of the early morning, a whisper of unease crept into his thoughts. Jacques de Molay's curse, spoken on that fateful night, lingered in his mind like a shadow he could not shake. The Knights Templar had been forged in the crucible of the Crusades, a brotherhood bound by a singular mission: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Their name was derived from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where they established their headquarters in a building believed to be the ruins of King Solomon's Temple. The Templars were not merely warriors. They were monks, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They wore simple white mantles adorned with a red cross, a symbol of their willingness to shed their blood for the faith. Their lives were governed by a strict code, the rule of the Templars, which dictated every aspect of their existence. But it was their secrecy that set them apart. The inner workings of the order were known only to its members, and even within the order there were layers of secrecy. The Templars had become an enigma, inspiring both awe and fear. Whispers began to circulate about their strange rites and hidden treasures. Some spoke of a mysterious idol, Baphomet, to which the Templars were said to offer worship, an accusation that would later be used against them. As the Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land began to fall, the Templars returned to Europe, their wealth and power intact. They became bankers, lending money to kings and popes alike, amassing a fortune that made them both influential and envied. But their wealth and influence also made them a target. The Templars knew their position was precarious, but they believed that their oath-bound secrecy and the righteousness of their cause would protect them. They did not foresee the betrayal that would come, not from enemies abroad but from those they had once served. Night had fallen over Paris, and the city lay shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow the light of the moon. Within the shadowed corridors of the Louvre, King Philip IV paced the stone floors, his mind churning with the weight of his decisions. The first phase of his plan had been executed flawlessly. The Templars were in chains, their once impregnable fortresses reduced to silent tombs. Yet as he gazed out over the darkened city, the king could not shake the unease that clung to him like a second skin. He knew well that the downfall of the Templars was only the beginning. Accusations, no matter how damning, were but words on parchment. What was needed now was proof, evidence that could not be denied, confessions that would forever stain the Templars' legacy with the mark of the damned. In the bowels of Paris, beneath the grand spires and bustling streets, lay a network of dungeons, damp, cold, and reeking of decay. Here the air was thick with despair, the silence broken only by the distant drip of water seeping through ancient stone. It was in these chambers that the Templars, once proud knights of Christ, were held in chains, their bodies battered and broken, their spirits teetering on the edge of oblivion. Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's chancellor and the architect of this dark plot, moved through the corridors with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. His eyes, sharp and calculating, took in the scene before him, the Templars, huddled in their cells, their faces gaunt with fear and exhaustion. They were no longer knights, no longer warriors. They were men, stripped of their titles, reduced to the barest essence of humanity by the relentless grind of the Inquisition's gears. The first Templar to be brought in was Brother André. His eyes were hollow, his body weak, yet there was a defiance in him that even the torturers had not managed to break. He was dragged before de Nogaret, and for a moment there was silence. "Brother André," de Nogaret began, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "You know why you are here." André said nothing, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Speak, brother," de Nogaret insisted, his tone hardening. "Confess your sins, the worship of Baphomet, the heresy, the blasphemy against God. Confess, and your suffering will end." Brother André's gaze slowly lifted, meeting de Nogaret's eyes. "I have nothing to confess," he said, his voice weak but steady. "We are innocent of these charges." De Nogaret's face darkened, and he nodded to the torturer standing nearby. The man stepped forward, and the last remnants of hope faded from Brother André's eyes. The relentless Inquisition, fueled by torture and forced confessions, proved devastatingly effective. Over the course of several years, from 1307 to 1314, the trials dragged on, leaving a trail of death and despair. Nearly 15,000 Templars were arrested across Europe, with hundreds burned at the stake, including prominent leaders like Grand Master Jacques de Molay. One by one, the Templars were broken, their spirits crushed under the weight of unimaginable pain and fear. The once mighty order, revered and feared across Christendom, was systematically dismantled. Their lands and treasures were seized, their members imprisoned or executed, and their legacy stained with accusations of heresy and blasphemy. By the time the trials were complete, the Templar name had been all but obliterated, their influence shattered, and their fate sealed by the ruthless machinations of King Philip IV and his allies. Pope Clement V lay in his bed, his body racked with pain. His once rosy complexion had turned a sickly grey, his limbs trembling uncontrollably. He was a man besieged by illness, haunted by the knowledge that he had betrayed those he had sworn to protect. Clement's mind drifted back to the day he had given in to King Philip IV's demands, the day he had signed the death warrant for the Knights Templar. He had thought it a necessary evil, a sacrifice to maintain the stability of the church. But now, as he lay on his deathbed, he wondered if he had been wrong. The fever that gripped his body had grown worse in the past weeks, and the healers were at a loss. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces grave. The Pope's condition defied explanation. It was as if his very soul was being torn apart from within. Clement's eyes fluttered open, and he stared up at the ornate ceiling of his chambers. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering candles placed around his bed. He could feel his strength slipping away, and with it, the certainty that had once guided him. A shadow fell across his face, and he turned his head to see a figure standing at the foot of his bed. The figure was cloaked in darkness, the hood obscuring his features. Pope Clement's breath caught in his throat as a cold dread settled over him. "Who are you?" Clement whispered, his voice weak, barely audible. The figure remained silent, but as he stepped closer, the light from the candles revealed his face, a face that Clement knew all too well, though it was impossible. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood before him, his eyes burning with the same defiance he had shown on the pyre. "Jacques," Clement gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. "This cannot be. You are dead." De Molay's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it, only cold judgment. "You condemned me to die, Clement," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. "You betrayed the Templars and set in motion events that will bring ruin to your church and your kingdom. The curse is real, and you will face God's judgment for your sins." Clement tried to speak, to plead for mercy, but his voice failed him. The figure of de Molay seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as he leaned over the dying pope. "You will answer for your crimes before the year is out," de Molay continued, his voice low and menacing. "And your death will be but the beginning. The line of kings that conspired against us will fall, and France will be bathed in blood." With that, the figure of de Molay seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving Clement alone in his terror. The Pope's breath came in ragged gasps as the room spun around him. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the flickering light of the candles, their flames dancing like specters in the night. Pope Clement V died that night, his body found cold and lifeless in his bed. The healers could not explain it, and the church was thrown into chaos. The curse of the Templars had claimed its first victim, and the prophecy was set in motion. King Philip IV sat in his private chambers staring at the flickering flames in the hearth. The autumn winds howled outside, rattling the windows of the grand palace at Fontainebleau. The king's brow was furrowed, his face pale and drawn. The events of the past months had weighed heavily on him, and the death of Pope Clement V had only deepened his unease. Philip had dismissed the notion of a curse, attributing Clement's death to illness and the Pope's own frailty. But in the silence of his chambers, with only the crackling fire for company, the king found himself haunted by Jacques de Molay's final words. He could not shake the feeling that something was coming for him, something dark and unstoppable. A sudden pain gripped Philip's chest, sharp and excruciating. He gasped, clutching at his heart, his vision swimming with black spots. The pain intensified, radiating down his arm and into his back. He tried to call out for help, but the words died in his throat. As he slumped forward in his chair, the room seemed to close in around him, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The flames in the hearth flickered wildly, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Philip's breath came in ragged gasps as he felt his life slipping away. In his final moments, Philip's thoughts turned to his children. His sons who would inherit the throne. Would they too be cursed? Would the line of Valois suffer the same fate that was befalling him now? The curse of the Templars loomed over him, a dark cloud that he could not escape. With a final shuddering breath, King Philip IV known as Philip the Fair, died in his chambers. His servants found him the next morning, slumped in his chair, his face frozen in a grimace of pain and fear. The curse of Jacques de Molay had claimed its second victim, and the prophecy of doom that had been spoken on the pyre was beginning to unfold. On November 29, 1314, Philip IV died in agony, his body twisted in pain. The Valois line, which Philip had sought to secure, soon fell into turmoil. His sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles VI, each took the throne in turn, but their reigns were short and plagued by misfortune. None of them produced a male heir who could carry on the line, and with the death of Charles IV in 1328, the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty ended. But the curse did not die with them. It spread like a poison through the land, infecting the very soul of France. The country was plunged into a state of chaos, with rival factions vying for control, in what would become known as the 100 Years' War. It began as a dispute over the rightful succession to the French throne, but the 100 Years' War quickly became something far more sinister. The curse that had been set in motion by Jacques de Molay had taken hold, turning brother against brother and plunging France into a state of perpetual conflict. The early years of the war were marked by a series of crushing defeats for the French. The English, led by the ruthless Edward III, won decisive victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, leaving the French forces in disarray. The French nobility, divided and weakened by internal strife, were unable to mount a unified defense. The war was not just a clash of armies, it was a war of attrition, a grinding, relentless conflict that drained the life from the land. The countryside was ravaged, towns and villages burned, and the people of France were left to suffer the horrors of war, famine, disease, and the ever-present threat of violence. As the years dragged on, the war became a breeding ground for superstition and fear. The curse of the Templars was whispered about in hushed tones, a dark force that seemed to hang over the land like a storm cloud. The madness that had plagued the Valois kings was seen as a manifestation of the curse, a curse that would doom France to suffer until it was purged by fire and blood. The reign of Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, was the darkest chapter in this cursed history. Charles, plagued by bouts of insanity, was unfit to rule, and his reign was marked by a series of disastrous decisions that only deepened the crisis. The court was divided into warring factions, each vying for control of the king and the kingdom. The people of France, once proud and strong, were now broken, their spirits crushed by years of war and suffering. The curse that had begun with the burning of Jacques de Molay had reached its zenith, and it seemed that there was no end in sight. But the curse had a purpose. It was a test, a crucible that would forge a new king, a king who would rise from the ashes of the old order and lead France out of the darkness. The curse would not be lifted until that king was crowned, and the blood of the old line was washed away. The night air in Domremy was thick with the whispers of the unseen. The village, tucked away in a quiet corner of France, seemed to exist on the edge of both reality and dreams. It was here, in the shadows of her humble home, that a young peasant girl named Joan first began to hear the voices. They came to her in the stillness of the night, when the world was cloaked in darkness and the veil between the earthly and the divine grew thin. At first, the voices were faint, distant murmurs that stirred her from sleep, leaving her heart pounding and her mind filled with questions. But as the nights passed, they grew clearer, more insistent, until they became as real to her as the sound of her own breath. Joan could not explain it, but she knew deep in her soul that these were not ordinary voices. They spoke with a power and authority that transcended the mortal realm, their words imbued with a purpose that filled her with both awe and dread. They were the voices of saints, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, commanding her to take up arms in the name of God and save France from the brink of ruin. The task was impossible, absurd even. Joan was no warrior. She was a simple peasant, untrained in the arts of war. Yet the conviction that burned within her could not be denied. It was as if the very breath of God had filled her lungs, compelling her to act. With a heart full of faith and a mind fixed on the divine mission, Joan set out on a journey that would lead her to the court of Charles VII, the Dauphin of France. The court was a place of shadows and intrigue, where whispers of betrayal and doubt lingered in every corner. Charles, a man beset by fear and uncertainty, sat upon a throne that felt more like a prison. His claim to the throne was weak, his forces in disarray, and the Treaty of Troyes had disinherited him in favor of the English king, Henry VI. Desperation hung over him like a shroud. When Joan entered the court, she was met with skepticism and derision. Her simple peasant garb stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the court, and her youthful face belied the gravity of her message. But when she spoke, her voice carried with it a weight that silenced the room. "Your Majesty," she said, her eyes locked onto Charles's, "God has sent me to deliver France from her enemies and to see you crowned as the rightful king." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Charles shifted uneasily in his seat, his advisors murmuring amongst themselves, their expressions a mix of doubt and curiosity. The Maid of Orléans, as she had come to be known, had sparked something in them, something they could not quite grasp. "And how do you propose to do that?" Charles asked, his tone more wary than dismissive. He was a man haunted by failure, his dreams of kingship slipping through his fingers like sand. Yet there was something in Joan's gaze that stirred a flicker of hope within him. Joan did not waver. "It is not I who will lead the army, Your Majesty. It is God. I am but his instrument. The voices of the saints have guided me to you, to lift the siege of Orléans and to see you crowned at Reims." Silence fell over the court. Charles hesitated, his mind a battleground of doubt and desperate hope. Could this girl, this unlikely savior, truly be the answer to his prayers? Or was she merely a madwoman, led astray by the delusions of a desperate mind? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles spoke. "Very well," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. "I will give you command of an army. But understand this. If you fail, it will be your life, not mine, that is forfeit." Joan bowed her head, her expression serene. "I do not fear for my life, Your Majesty. I fear only for the soul of France." The dawn was still hours away, but the soldiers of France were already awake, their hearts heavy with the weight of the coming battle. The city of Orléans, a crumbling bastion of French resistance, lay shrouded in mist, its walls battered by months of relentless English siege. For many, hope had withered long ago, replaced by a grim acceptance of the inevitable. But on this night, something had changed. A new presence had come among them, a presence that radiated with a strange, almost otherworldly power. At the head of the French troops, clad in white armor that gleamed like a beacon in the darkness, rode Joan of Arc. To the weary soldiers, she seemed more apparition than mortal, her figure illuminated by the dim glow of distant torches. Whispers of her divine mission had spread like wildfire through the ranks, and with them, a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, the men felt the stirrings of hope. Joan raised her banner high, the sacred standard fluttering in the night air. "Forward, men," she called, her voice carrying over the silence like a clarion call. "God is with us. The city will be freed today, by his will." The words sent a ripple of energy through the troops, and they surged forward, their steps quickening as they approached the enemy lines. The English, entrenched and confident in their siege, were taken aback by the ferocity of the French attack. It was as if a force greater than any army was driving the men forward, a force that could not be stopped. Joan led the charge, her presence on the battlefield like a figure from prophecy. The French soldiers followed her with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism, their fear of death eclipsed by their faith in her divine mission. But the battle was far from easy. The English fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the end of their campaign. In the midst of the chaos, an English arrow found its mark, striking Joan in the shoulder. She staggered, her hand instinctively reaching for the wound, but she did not fall. Instead, she gripped her banner tighter, raising it high above her head as if to defy the very heavens. "Do not fear," she shouted, a voice filled with a determination that cut through the din of battle. "It is only a scratch. Press on, for God is with us." The sight of her, bloodied but unyielding, sent a surge of adrenaline through the French ranks. They fought with renewed vigor, their weapons cutting through the enemy with a ferocity that seemed almost superhuman. Joan's presence on the battlefield was like a force of nature, unstoppable and undeniable. By nightfall, the siege of Orléans was broken. The city, long besieged and battered, was free at last. The French soldiers, their faces streaked with blood and sweat, looked to Joan with a reverence that bordered on worship. She had done the impossible. She had turned the tide of a war that had seemed all but lost. But as Joan looked out over the battlefield, her heart was heavy. The voices that had guided her to this victory had also whispered of the trials yet to come. The war was not over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But for now, in this moment, she had fulfilled her purpose. The siege was lifted, and the path to Rheims lay open before her. And so, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, rode forth once more, her banner held high, leading France toward a destiny written in the stars. The victory at Orléans was not just a military triumph. It was the turning of a tide that had long seemed impossible to shift. But Joan's role extended far beyond the battlefield. She was a symbol, a beacon of hope in a land that had been ravaged by war and despair for nearly a century. Joan's presence infused the French people with a new sense of purpose, a belief that they were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for the soul of their nation. Her visions and unwavering faith in the divine mission had galvanized the troops, but they had also reignited a sense of destiny in Charles VII. She convinced him to take decisive steps toward reclaiming his rightful crown, steps that he had previously been too hesitant, too uncertain to take. The Grand Cathedral of Rheims stood as a sentinel of ancient power, its towering spires piercing the early morning mist that clung to the city like a shroud. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, mingling with the whispers of the gathered nobles. The light that filtered through the stained glass windows cast an eerie, otherworldly glow across the cold stone floors, painting the sacred space in hues of blood red and gold. Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, knelt before the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable, pressing down on him like the hand of God himself. Every breath he took felt labored, as if the very air in the cathedral was laden with the expectations of centuries past. Standing just behind him, her presence both humble and commanding, was Joan of Arc. Clad in her simple armor, her hands clasped in prayer, she was a striking contrast to the opulence of the court. Yet despite her unadorned appearance, it was Joan who held the attention of many in the room. The Maid of Orléans, the peasant girl who had defied all odds, was now the divine force that had brought Charles to this sacred moment. The Archbishop stood before them, an imposing figure draped in robes of crimson and white, his hands steady as he held the crown aloft. The crown, a symbol of kingship and the culmination of a divine mandate, seemed to radiate with a power that was palpable, as if it carried within it the voices of all the kings who had come before. "By the grace of God," the Archbishop intoned, his voice reverberating through the vast expanse of the cathedral, "you are now the rightful King of France." The words hung in the air, echoing off the ancient walls, as if the very stones were bearing witness to the sacred rite. Outside, the tolling of the cathedral's bells began to resonate through the city, their deep, mournful tones adding to the sense of gravity that enveloped the moment. Charles could feel the eyes of the assembled court upon him, a sea of faces etched with a mixture of reverence, fear, and expectation. The crown, now poised above his head, seemed to hover in the air for an eternity, as if the weight of history itself was hesitating, unsure if this man was truly worthy to bear the burden of kingship. As the archbishop slowly lowered the crown, Charles felt a surge of emotions course through him. Doubt, fear, hope, all colliding in a tempest within his soul. He glanced back at Joan, seeking some reassurance in her presence. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in silent prayer, but there was an aura of calm determination about her, as if she knew with absolute certainty that this was the will of God. Joan opened her eyes, meeting Charles's gaze with a serene, unshakable confidence. Her faith in his destiny, in the divine plan that had led them both to this moment, was evident in every fiber of her being. She nodded slightly, a gesture of encouragement that filled Charles with a renewed sense of purpose. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the culmination of all his struggles, and yet a dark shadow lingered at the edges of his consciousness, whispering of the curse that had haunted his lineage. He could almost feel the presence of Jacques de Molay in the room, a reminder of the heavy price that had been paid for this victory. The crown came down. The stone walls of the courtroom loomed high above Joan of Arc, cold and unyielding as the men who sat in judgment before her. She stood in the center, her wrists bound in iron, her body weary from weeks of imprisonment and relentless questioning. But her spirit remained unbroken. "Do you deny that you have been guided by voices?" the lead inquisitor demanded, his voice a sharp blade that cut through the stale air. Joan's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I do not deny it. The voices I hear are those of the saints sent by God to guide me." A murmur rippled through the room, fear, disbelief, and something darker. The inquisitor's eyes narrowed. "And yet you claim to have led armies, to have dictated terms to kings," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is that not the height of arrogance for a mere peasant girl?" "I am nothing but a servant of God," Joan replied, her voice calm and resolute. "It was he who led the armies, not I. It was his will that Charles be crowned, not mine." The inquisitor's quill scratched furiously across the parchment, as if trying to trap her words in ink. "You stand accused of heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. How do you plead?" Joan's voice did not waver. "I have always been faithful to God and his church. If I am to be condemned, it is not by the laws of men, but by the will of God." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a blade poised to drop. The inquisitors exchanged glances, their decision made long before she had ever spoken a word. The sentence was pronounced: death by burning. The marketplace of Rouen was filled with the acrid scent of smoke and the oppressive heat of the midday sun. The wooden pyre stood tall in the center of the square, a monument to the brutal finality of judgment. Joan was led to the stake, her steps steady despite the chains that bound her wrists and ankles. The executioner, a shadowy figure with a torch in hand, stepped forward to ignite the kindling piled at her feet. The flames leapt to life, their hungry tongues licking up the sides of the pyre, eager to consume the young woman who stood above them. As the fire climbed higher, Joan lifted her voice above the crackling wood, strong and clear. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," she prayed, her eyes locked on the heavens. The flames danced around her, a consuming force, but her spirit remained unbowed. The crowd watched in silence, their faces a mix of horror and awe as the flames reached their peak, engulfing Joan in a fiery embrace. Her voice continued unwavering until the fire finally stole it away, leaving only the crackling of the flames and the smell of burning wood. Joan of Arc was gone, her body consumed by the fire. Her death was more than an execution. It was the final act in a drama that had begun years before, with the curse of a dying man and the madness of kings. The crowning of Charles VII had lifted the curse that had plagued France for so long, But Joan had paid the ultimate price for that victory. Her death was meant to silence her, to erase her influence, but instead it sanctified her, turning her into a martyr for a cause greater than herself. As her ashes scattered on the wind, the bells of Notre Dame tolled once more. As the crown came down on Charles VII's head, a cloaked figure watched from the shadows of the cathedral. Hidden behind a column, he remained still, his face obscured by the hood that draped low over his eyes. The light from the stained glass windows bathed the scene in hues of red and gold, casting long shadows that danced across the stone floor. The archbishop's voice resonated through the sacred space, solemn and final. The crown settled on Charles's brow, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The figure's gaze never left the new king. As the crown touched Charles's head, he felt the shift in the air, knowing that the curse of Jacques de Molay had finally run its course. Slowly, the cloaked figure turned and slipped through the side door of the cathedral, his movements silent and purposeful. In the streets outside, the bells of Notre Dame began to toll, their deep tones echoing through the city. The figure paused, allowing the sound to wash over him, then pulled back his hood, revealing a weathered face marked by years of secrecy and shadow. He was a Templar, one of the last, a survivor of the order that had been betrayed and dismantled over a century ago. As he moved through the crowd, his presence went unnoticed, his mission eternal. The Templars had always been more than knights. They were the guardians of secrets, protectors of a truth that could shape the world. And though the curse had been lifted, their work was far from done. The dawn of a new era had begun, but the Templars remained, watching, waiting, guiding history from the shadows. And with that understanding, the Templar melted into the crowd, disappearing once more into the annals of history, where his order had always thrived.